Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the third of our current series of Gifford lectures. My name is Mona Siddiqui and I'm a member of the Gifford Committee, and it's a privilege to be chairing today's lecture and welcoming Professor Vatimo back. Most of you by now know something of Professor Vatimo's work and his public life, but I thought this is the third evening, and in order to share something personal with you, and I asked him if there was a personal reflection he might want to give. And 2 days in Glasgow, and he said he's looking for a raincoat, and he can't find one. So I think I would make a plea to the audience that if you really want to show your appreciation of his lectures, perhaps you can help him find a raincoat. Professor Vatimo.
Of course, it is not a philosophical problem, but I discovered yesterday that my raincoat has a hole, so I should buy another one. It would be a good souvenir of Glasgow and its climate, the atmosphere. But I didn't find it. I got some indications for a small street close to Buchanan Street on the left, and then on the left I took all the notes. Tomorrow I'll try again. And thank you for any indication you could give during the discussion. Of course we can. We can. I forgot my umbrella is nevertheless a part of the complete works by Nietzsche, published in critical edition by the Gruyter. So, okay. I need a raincoat. Stop. I go on. Like yesterday, I will try to read very quietly and clearly my text so that there is no danger of getting lost in everything. Like a sort of psychoanalytical session. Okay, free associations. No, not at all. I'll try to be very rigorous, as far as I can, of course. The title of today, as you say, The End of Reality is delayed. We have still some time until tomorrow, but today is Being an Event. In the development of the discussion through our interpretation of Heidegger beyond phenomenology, we are bound to yet again encounter the implications of the conclusion of Nietzsche's sentence, and this too is an interpretation. Like Heidegger, we want to exit. I use the we because it is not a plurale majestatis, it's a pluralis humilitatis. I don't want you to imagine that I think that. Of course, I think that we have to think that, and so on and so forth. Like Heidegger, we want to exit objectivistic metaphysics because we feel it as a threat to freedom and to the projectuality, the project character of existence. If being is the objectivity ascertained by rigorous science, that which Husserl also thought philosophy ought to be, at least until he declares that the dream was over, ausgeträumt, philosophy as a rigorous science, then we living beings are not. If being is objectivity, we cannot say that we are, because we are not objective. That's clear. And it is not only a matter of searching for a notion of beings that can include us in its theoretical sphere, but more importantly, that can, in the concreteness of existence, free us from the chains that the society of total organization places upon us by shaping our life on the idea of being as object. In this perspective, which is the perspective, the living being itself becomes an object. If the only reality is objectivity, you have to become the most objective possible. So, for instance, no feelings, no hopes, or all this doesn't matter. Maybe it is limited to the aesthetic sphere of existence, which is not so serious, not that serious. It is in the search for a different way of thinking being that the idea of the event matures and that hermeneutic ontology takes shape in Heidegger. I will not run through the existential analytic, it is a part of being and time of Heidegger, where the grounds for the destruction of the history of ontology, destruction of the history of ontology, or rather the destruction of objectivistic metaphysics are put forward. But don't forget that all depends on that first part of Sein und Zeit in this construction. While the search for a different way of thinking being is motivated in Heidegger and in us not so much by theoretical reasons, but by the ethical political motives, not to accept, the ethical political will not to accept the word of total organization. I didn't translate it myself, luckily, because otherwise it would be even worse. So sometimes I have to remember what I read. The search for another way of thinking being outside of metaphysics is not motivated so much by theoretical reasons, but by the ethical political will not to accept the word of total organization that metaphysics prepares and accompanies. While this is the case, the existential analysis of the first part of Being and Time sheds light on the interpretative nature of every experience and therefore justifies also on the theoretical level the intolerance for metaphysics. So that generally we say that Heidegger was inspired by the need of subtracting himself from the domination of the total organization of society and so on. But on the theoretical level, it's true that if we follow the analysis of existence he gives in the first part of Being and Time, then we have also good theoretical reasons to refuse the objectification of metaphysics, the metaphysical the universal objectivity. Not even theoretically can one find a good reason for thinking that having an experience of the world means mirroring things objectively. A phenomenological analysis of the world shows that things are not, in the first place, and for the most part, zuerst und zumeist, as Heidegger says in Sein und Zeit, objects, but presences that have a significance for us and that can become objects of a pure description only with a conscious act of abstraction, one also motivated by interest. What is a cloud? Nobody thinks of a cloud that it is a mass of gas and so on. He says, well, it's a problem for me for tomorrow, for the weekend. So, of course, if one wants to take an objectifying scientific attitude, one abandons this immediate zuerst und zumeist. For the most part, in the everyday life, and goes to the laboratory. So it is things become objects when somebody assumes artificially, in many sense, or deliberately, an attitude of objectification. And probably not because of the love for truth, but because of some interest. We need to know how a cloud functions because we want to protect ourselves from the rain and so on and so forth. Okay. But it is not that this is objectivity and the other ones are just imaginations and so on. We have an experience of things only on the background of this. Things are primarily, for this point of view, instruments. They have a meaning to us. It's a sort of pragmatic analysis of the relation to the world that which Heidegger discusses in the first page of Sein und Zeit. And the word is an instrumental totality, since an instrument is never given as an isolated thing, but precisely made by something in view of something else, and so on and so forth. We have an experience of things only on the background of this preliminary given word totality, which is unveiled to us in the historical language that we find ourselves speaking, and in virtue of which we are always already acquainted with the world. Being in the world means to be familiar with a totality of things, of instruments, which are connected among them by this is for that, for that, for that, and at the end they refer to us as the function head, which was that of the transcendental ego in Husserl or in Kant, is basically this. There is a project, a central project, around which a world of instruments turns and so on. What we call being, capital B, and what we cannot identify with the totality of objects, because otherwise we would not be again and again. If being were only the totality of objects, we cannot predicate being of ourselves. So what we call being and what we cannot identify with the totality of objects is rather the horizon in which, as Kant had already taught us to a certain degree, things come to being. The world articulates itself within the a priori forms of the sensibility and of the intellect, as you know. The encounter with things, according to an articulation within a horizon of foreunderstanding, is what we can call interpretation. Dilthey had already spoken of interpretation as a knowledge that presupposes some reciprocal belonging between the subject and the object. For him, it was the historical knowledge, of course. If I speak of Julius Caesar, I cannot speak of him as an object because I live in Italy, but you live in England. You have something in Scotland, please. I saw a reaction. Okay, you live in Scotland, but at any rate you live in a reality, in a plane, in a world which was influenced by Julius Caesar, so you cannot completely objectify him. History is that. There is a previous connection between me and my object in the field of historical knowledge. Only in that we will see that it is not only for that. But let me explain, especially for those not familiar with Heidegger's text. Every verification or falsification of a scientific proposition, of a judgment on an object, is possible only within the paradigms already available to the scientist or to the interested scientific community before the individual experiment. I have already cited Thomas Kuhn, which is my agent in the field of epistemology. He doesn't know it, of course, but many of the agents of the CIA don't know that they are agents of the CIA. Simply serve unconsciously. Here, Thomas Kuhn helps us to go beyond Dilthey. Even scientific knowledge is a hermeneutic affair, which I emphasize this because it is the overcoming of the traditional distinction between science of the spirit and science of nature, of course. It would want to be that. The horizon of language within which an individual or a community experience the world, namely within which things come to being, is historical and finite. Being as Zeinun Zeit thinks it, or tries to think it, is a hermeneutic event, a happening of historical linguistic horizons for which one can speak of a history of being. The argument is rather linear. If being is not the objectivity given once and for all, it has to do with our previous understanding of it, our paradigms. But paradigms are not eternal, as natural languages are not the language, are becoming, transforming, and so on. We are always put in relation to things within a horizon of language which is not pure language but historical natural language. That's why we can speak in Heidegger's terms of a history of being. Being happens as the historical opening of a horizon within which things and we ourselves become visible, become accessible. I am outlining here very summarily the contents and results of the existential analytic of Sein und Zeit because they are the distant support of that which I propose to call, in the title of this group of lectures, the end of reality. The path through which Heidegger constructs these results is not simply the theoretical research of that fundamental ontology that was lacking in Husserlian phenomenology. The urgency of this problem is not, in this case, motivated by systematic reasons. It is moved by practical political demands, the same that were expressed in the poetry and art of the avant-garde at the beginning of the last century. I have made already an allusion to this spirit of utopia, to what Ernest Bloch describes and discusses in his book Spirit of Utopia of 1919 and second edition 1923. We should keep in mind its value as an indication of philosophical method that, as I suggested yesterday, correspond to Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach, changing the world, not interpreting it. It also serves as a guiding thread for interpreting the thought of Heidegger, as in the case of every other thinker, by the way, by judging it juxta propria principia, on the basis of its originary motives. If we catch, or we have good reasons to think that we catch the originary motives of Heidegger's itinerary of thinking, we can always try to distinguish what is authentically Heideggerian in his thought and what is a mistake, for instance. It's like making the critical edition of the works of Plato. You start from a dialogue which is surely authentic because, and then you measure upon that the other ones. If there he says that it never rains, probably you have to confront it, to compare it with the dialogue in which he speaks of raining, as a usual task he did, of course. But now, today we should have started with the problem, is it snowing or not? Because it's much colder than yesterday. So, to judge, to try to catch the original inspiration of Heidegger's philosophical itinerary, of course it is not all in that, helps you also to judge whether or not he was right or he was mistaken when he became a Nazi, for instance. It is not just a matter of not liking that he was a Nazi. It was a theoretical mistake. We should keep in mind its value and so on. That, for example, is also valuable when judging whether the ascent to Nazism in 1933 was faithful to these originary motives or not. If it was not, then there are good arguments for contending that the sympathy for Nazism was not a necessary consequence of Heidegger's philosophy, and indeed, in light of these very motives, can be judged as an error and a self-misunderstanding. The existential analytic is the basis on which the notion of being as event develops. Things are, in the strong sense of the word, as far as they are given within the thrown project that is contained or revealed in the historical language of a human community. It is in this language that we speak and that speak us, there are always given paradigms within which the world is accessible to us and that allows us to connect, to have an idea of ourselves also we have access to things and to ourselves within the horizon of the language which we inherit and so on. In this language, a collection of criteria for the true and the false are always given. Therefore, the fact that knowing is the articulation of a foreunderstanding does not mean that there are no differences between truth and error, and that anything goes, like one would be tempted to say. What Heidegger calls the event of being is not the happening of a successful experiment of normal science, according to a paradigm in use. It is above all the paradigmatic revolution, the institution of a new historical horizon, the very birth of a new world. We can never say a priori what occurs when being happens. By the way, the dialectic of langue and parole in the Saussure seems to be a good example for that. There is always a langue on the background of which you pronounce your parole. But the langue doesn't remain the same after that you have invented your parole. And if you exaggerate in inventing too many paroles, probably you create a new paradigm. So the paradigm is transformed by the concrete historical application of it and so on. The event of being, so, is the happening of truth, as we said, in the two senses that the term truth has for Heidegger. Truth as aletheia, as he uses to say with the Greek word, is the historical opening of the paradigm, which by not being the eternal structure of a metaphysical and Parmenian being is thought as event. If the opening of truth is not doesn't coincide with the order of being given, if being is not identical with objectivity, then it has to be considered as event, as something which happens. It was not yet there. So the event of truth, in this sense, is the fact that at a certain moment, in a way which we don't know exactly how to describe, a new paradigm is instituted. Take the famous example of Copernicus and Ptolemaios and the transition from the one paradigm to the other ones and so on. Or the fact that we don't know whether there is a vampire among you or not. We don't have any longer criteria for deciding whether one is a vampire or not, but we never decide that at a certain moment this paradigm, including a vampirology, was finished. Nobody can say that. Truth as aletheia is the historical opening of the paradigm, which by not being the eternal structure of a metaphysical and Parmenian being is thought as event. But truth is also the verified proposition according to the very criteria of the paradigm, therefore normal science in Kuhn's sense. You can understand that. I can verify or falsify a proposition within the horizon of a paradigm. It doesn't put immediately under question the paradigm. In this sense, it is normal science, as Kuhn called it, normal and revolutionary science and so on. When the essay on the origin of the work of art, 1936, says that the work is the setting into work of truth, ins Werksetzung der Wahrheit. The meaning of the term truth must be understood in the first sense, in the sense of aletheia. Imagine if somebody is looking for factual truth in poetry. Sometimes in the school, the children are invited to summarize a poem. So they say, the poet says that when it rained, he said, this would be, there is no truth in that, and nobody looks for a truth in poetry in these terms. The work of art is the foundation of a world. The experience that we have of it, according to Heidegger, changes the coordinates within which the world appears to us. I think that, especially, I don't know whether now I read novels which change my view of the world. But when I was in the secondary school, I used to read Thomas Mann, for instance, The Magic Mountain. And it was really an experience of this kind. Something was changing in my view of the world. Take the experience of reading Dostoevsky, which, as a matter of fact, is a sort of experience provoking spiritual transformation, answers, or rejection, things like that. But by the way, this is what a work being the opening of a world, of a new world, would be. It is obvious that this emphatic significance of aesthetic experience counts for those great epochal works that Heidegger has in mind. Homer's poem for the Greek world, the Bible for all of the Western culture, perhaps Dante, Shakespeare, Hölderlin. But what about Joyce's Ulysses, for instance? What about a small sonata by Vivaldi or by Galuppi? What really you imagine that this opens a world? These are interesting examples, but we can discuss also later. Here too, it is always difficult to establish, as in the aforementioned case of Langen and Parol, where one has to find the limit between normal and revolutionary. It is like the fact that a new paradigm announces itself without clear definition. So, for instance, let's say for the Vivaldi sonata, what is opened is, in a sense, a world in which the work invites us to live. How would it be nice to be a Venetian of the 18th century, listening to this Vivaldi sonata in the cafe? What is the name of the cafe in Piazza San Marco? So, vabbè. It's not Café de Flore. This is in Paris, in Saint-Germain-des-Prés. Oh, va bene. No matter. Alzheimer is a German who drives me crazy. Okay. So even in this special small case, of course, also in Ulysses. Joyce's Ulysses is problematic, because what really do I grasp of all that history of this man? By the way, described also in very private positions. He starts to go to the bathroom. It is not so clear, but it is possible to apply this scheme to the analysis of the work of art, and I will be glad to discuss it later. Certainly, in the case of art, since we are not talking about the production of objects of use that clearly remain within the paradigm, their normal science, so to speak, we must always say that some revolution happens. The reading of a Dostoevsky novel really changes our view of the world. Therefore, it really opens a new paradigm for the one who has the experience. Nothing it is any longer as it was before, in many senses. I mean, it's like meeting a person, your guru, somebody who inspires you. This was a notation which Michel Dufresne, who was a phenomenological aesthetician, French, died some 10, 15 years ago, proposed to interpret Heidegger's aesthetics. I don't know whether he wanted to interpret Heidegger's aesthetics, because as a good phenomenologist, he didn't want to be Heideggerian. But by the way, he spoke of the work of art as a quasi-sujet, as an almost subject. It is something which you don't put within your word beside other things, but which is another view of the world with which you confront yourself and so on. The historical linguistic horizons within which the Kantian a priori are incorporated. Karl Otto Appel had spoken of this philosophy as a transformation of Kantianism or a semanticization of Kantianism. Where are the a priori forms? Of course, not in the structure of reason, in the language we speak. And it's interesting because it corresponds basically also to the idea of Heidegger. These historical linguistic horizons must be thought as events. Even if we never see the birth of a new word, we can only think being in this way if we do not want to fall back into the objectivistic metaphysics of the being there eternally and so on, which would render our existence ununderstandable, our historical existence unthinkable. In the essay on the work of art from 1936, this is the date of my birth, by the way. I just refer to things which are in the world in the same time as I am. In the essay of that, Heidegger also alludes to other ways in which truth happens. The main way in which truth happens is the work of art, put into Werksetzung of der Wahrheit. But beyond the work of art, a new word can also be born from a great moral or intellectual experience or from the foundation of a political order. There are a list of different ways of happening of the truth, which Heidegger never developed afterwards. And we can also understand why, probably. These indications remain obscure because in the works that follow, Heidegger will continue to seek out the happening of truth only in poetry and in the great words of the origins. Anaximander, Parmenides, also in the poets, Hölderlin, Rilke, and so on. It seems clear why he did not develop the discourse on politics. He was just returned from the misadventure with Nazism, and he preferred to not occupy himself with political events. Absolutely. It was a way of cancelling. Concentrating on the event of truth that happens in art also allowed him to construct an idealized image of the event of being, which seems to set aside every conflictual element. And this is strange, also because the essay on the work of art also spoke of a conflict between world and earth that characterizes the work. These are almost the most mysterious passages in Heidegger's work. What does this mean? That in the work of art there is a riss, a separation, a divide, a tension, a conflict between world and earth. Maybe you remember that he spoke of the fact that in the work of art, a world is exhibited and the earth is put forward. The earth is put forward as something which is not exhibitable, cannot be exhibited. It's the opposite of the world. So sometimes people have interpreted these two terms as matter and form. There is a matter of the work of art, there is a form of the work of art, but this is not exactly what Heidegger had in mind, probably. The problem is that I don't know exactly what he had in mind. We have to. But I know that it was not that. Otherwise, he would have said it. So, what interests here, however, is the very notion of conflict, that both the aesthetics inspired by Heidegger and also the philosophical hermeneutics which began with him, I'm thinking here above all of Gadamer and Varietum Methode, have interpreted, in my opinion, in a very peaceful, tranquilizing way. This conflict, but by the way, nobody speaks very much of it in the commentaries upon Heidegger and so on. And this justifies a question which was posed yesterday. Don't you think that this idea of being included in the language is a little bit too conservative, too tranquilizing, too harmonical, and so on and so forth? It is not so clear. As we know, Gadamer constructed his hermeneutics around the theme of dialogue. Truth, we can say, by taking up his thought, is event as it is the fusion of horizons, Horizonsverschmelzung. It's a very easy word. Please note it. Horizonsverschmelzung. Which means what happens at the end of a dialogue. There is a dialogue, you say A, I say B, then we both agree on C, for instance. Hey, it's not so. So Gadamer was a very peaceful man. Heidegger, not that much. Of course, he had different experience. A fusion of horizons that is verified as the always provisional conclusion of a dialogue between different positions. The pragmatic definition of truth that we also find in Rorty, the true is that which is good for us, easily leads back to this idea of agreement. And obviously, Habermas' theory of communicative action is also part of this general dialogical atmosphere. The popularity of hermeneutics is still today largely based on its reputation of being the philosophy of dialogue. So I have to save myself from this sort of marmellata. What is marmellata? Confiture. Sort of that's important. The popularity of hermeneutics is still today in its being considered as the philosophy of dialogue, which is taken as the basis of almost every public debate to which you are invited to participate. Dialogue between cultures, dialogue between classes, dialogue between individuals in the same society. Oh my God. In Italian, we have an expression which I transform because we say when we want to dismiss somebody, we say vai al diavolo, go to hell. But diavolo and dialogo in Italian are very close. So I say vai al dialogo, which means get away. No, it's a little bit exaggerated, of course. Perhaps the excessive popularity has made hermeneutics a commonplace. Yet again, as during the time of the existentialist Heidegger, early in the 20th century, what calls our attention, my at least attention, to the conflict that is inseparable from the happening of truth is not the demand for a theoretical clarification, but the need to react to an external situation, or better, a condition of culture in which it seems even philosophy finds itself. The new realism, I was polemizing against it already yesterday, that according to me characterizes the atmosphere of both continental and post-analytic philosophy today, could be characterized with the Heideggerian term of lack of emergency. There is no emergency. The impression we have in our time is that I think that my evocation of conflict, the attention I pay to the conflict in the definition of the happenings of truth and so on, is all obviously, like in Heidegger at the beginning of the century, he wanted to react to some practical political situation. It's inspired by the fact that I feel uneasy in a situation of marmellata, of dialogue everywhere. There is dialogue, my dear friend. Oh, dialogue. And well, okay. Certainly newspapers and other forms of information are full of events, and yet the dominant impression, this is the subjective description, of the citizens of the industrialized world, whether at its center or in the periphery and in the post-colonial slums, is that nothing ever happens anymore. The popularity of the World Cup, Football World Cup, is that there can happen something, but not very unforeseeable, because also in the national champion leagues, you may foresee who is going to win the campionato, the cup. The teams who are richer in players which cost more. So it's not, but anyway, we are interested in that also because we expect something. Nigeria has beaten Argentina. I say that for no, will beat Argentina. I say that for Santiago Zabala, who is a fan of Argentina. The fact, the participation of citizens in the democratic elections of many countries, especially in Europe, continues to decline, and it would be difficult to argue that people avoid the polls because they are doing well and they do not need any change. The fact is that a general resignation dominates, one that remains undisturbed even when there is an economic crisis like the one that we are experiencing now. I speak from my Italian experience, but I think Great Britain is not very different. What makes us speak against the lack of emergency, or better, what makes us feel this lack, this want, is the same discomfort that inspired Heidegger at the time of sein und Zeit. Lack of emergency means lack of liberty, the identification of being with the present order of entities, and of thought as the mirroring of the world as it is. We are again faced with the originary motives that inspired Heidegger and that are the necessary roots of any philosophy. The philosopher doesn't just respond to theoretical questions by searching to complete a system, for example, phenomenology, with what it's lacking. In the case of Husserl, there was fundamental ontology, or by resolving the problems opened up by a theory. I pointed to the profound ethical need that moved Husserl and that pushed him to search for a fundamental ontology. In Heidegger, who was much more religiously motivated than was a mathematical Husserl, the will to do philosophy as a search for existential authenticity is yet more profound and irreducible to any professional motivation. In conclusion means that I have still a couple of pages to read. That's for your assurance. In conclusion, how does the coming to light of a notion of being as hermeneutic event respond to the originary motivations of Heidegger's inquiry? We know that this idea of philosophy as a path to emancipation is as old as philosophy itself. What is the task of philosophy in a theory that no longer conceives of being in metaphysical terms as the given, what is? This is an interrogation. Spanish people do well to put also the interrogation mark at the beginning of the sentence because of what is the task of philosophy in a theory that no longer conceives of being in metaphysical terms as a given that the mind must only try to mirror in the most faithful and adequate way? Knowing that being is not an object but an event does not set us free. This was my initial motive. The Heideggerian effort to exit from metaphysics is moved by the need to overcome the forgetting of being, the forgetfulness of being in favor of entities and their givenness, which is precisely what dominates metaphysics. But once again, what does it mean to remember being, to exit from the forgetting of being? what I have tried really hard to show, I don't know, is that remembering being means thinking it radically as event, as a happening that we do not observe from a neutral vantage point, but in which we participate actively as interpreters. As participating interpreters, we cannot but live the event in terms of conflict. This is. The truth sets us free and redeems us, with this I return to my point of departure, only insofar as we participate actively in its event by committing ourselves to the conflict. I already recalled that the human, according to one of the more grandiloquent images of Heidegger, is the shepherd of being. Man is the shepherd man. Human being is the shepherd of being. He's not the lord of it, but in many ways he's responsible for it. If he does not decisively assume his own responsibility, that of mankind, on making truth happen at the expense of conflict, it is being itself that gets lost in the forgetting of metaphysics. This is a rather important point. Also, it is at the end of my presentation, so please pay attention. Still pay attention. I will. Okay. I will ask you questions afterwards, like in a class. A classroom, not in a class class struggle, no. It will be a classroom struggle, okay. Truth, namely the new word that is instituted, as one sees in art when new paradigms are opened, does not happen through a sort of natural process, like that of growing. Certainly Heidegger seems at times to think that death is the casket of being, lo scrigno, casket, sì, no, vabbè, insomma, la cassaforte, what do you call the cassaforte? The safe of being, because the succession of generations is also the condition for the renewal of worldviews, namely the happening of truth. But the event of truth not only reflects the natural succession of generations. This succession is also, and above all, conflict between generations themselves at times, but in general between interpretations that are mutually exclusive and that differ from each other, not only as diverse artistic styles, an ideal museum where the peace of aesthetic values reigns. Most generally and importantly, we are dealing with the great historical struggles, with social systems that want to take the place of others in the name of that which, in the terminology of the essay on the work of art, we could call the earth, the needs of survival, the common ties prior irrational, the will to free oneself from intolerable servitude, beginning with poverty. And this is interesting. Why something like the work of art happens? Heidegger doesn't give any answer. And the answer is related to the earthly motives which the artist has also. Feelings, instincts, vindication feelings against the other artist, Beethoven against Mozart, or Mozart against somebody else. This is the earthly root of the opening of new paradigms. Since the being of man must be thought as project, if not it will be forgotten in what it is specific to him. So truth, in the same meaning, in the same sense, truth as event involves a conflictuality that blocks us from seeing it solely as the objective givenness of epochal paradigms moved by a type of natural cyclical evolution, according to a rhythm of birth, growth, and aging that, as we know, constitutes the model of Oswald Spengler's philosophy of history. In the Heideggerian idea of the historical opening of truth, there is nothing natural at all, because even this would entail referring the happening of truth to an objective given in which the human is either only a spectator or a passive participant. Justifying conflict as a constitutive feature of the event of being seems, however, to implicate the preference for a sort of a kind of vitalistic metaphysics. But the point is that just because it cannot be thought as given, being has the character of newness and unpredictability that in general we associate with life. In relation to this, Hannah Arendt was correct to rebuke Heidegger for giving too much importance to in his philosophy to mortality and not enough to natality. You remember probably Hannah Arendt's objection. However, that may be more than a naturalistic conception of being. I don't know, I probably lost a part. However, that may be with Hannah Arendt. We are here confronted with not with a naturalistic conception of being as infinite vitality, which will make us think of Giordano Bruno and of the Renaissance philosophy, infinite vitality and so on. Walter Benjamin's, I cannot, but by the way, more than that, Walter Benjamin's thesis on the memory of the enslaved forefathers is also of value here for Heidegger. Remember what I said yesterday about Benjamin's revolutionary people being inspired not by the image of the grandsons liberated by the worry about the enslaved forefathers. Being is a radically new event because it is given to us as emancipation and liberation from a condition that we feel is intolerable rather than a luminously defined project of an alternative world. We know what we don't want more than a project that we have in mind very clearly and so on. That is what the essay on the work of art teaches us regarding its idea of the always ongoing battle between world and earth. As a definite form and the result of a successful formative process, as Luigi Parison, my master in Torino, used to say, the work opens and inaugurates a world, placing us in a sort of reality that is changed in virtue of the very meaning that the encounter with the work has for us. But at the same time, the newness of the work produces in us a homelessness, dépaysement, I would say in French, putting us out of our situation, what Freud would have called unfamiliar, unheimlich. You don't feel, and this is, for instance, the effect of Joyce's Ulysses. What the hell does you want to communicate me? The avant-garde art of the beginning of the 20th century was of this kind. Dada, Duchamp sending a urinoir to an exhibition, calling it Fountain. That was absolutely putting us in a homelessness. And this homelessness has many features of the existential anxiety mentioned in Sein und Zeit. We feel sort of swinging among. One uses to apply these terms to the analysis of the aesthetic experience, and this is interesting. But one can also attempt to do what Heidegger did not do in his essay. i.e. to read in these same terms other forms of the happening of truth suggested by Heidegger himself in that essay, such as religious or ethical experience, or even political experience. Let us not forget that here we are always thinking about the event of truth, of the birth of new words, not in descriptive but in interpretative terms, namely ones that implicate decision and assumption of responsibility. Also, without returning to the myth of Romanticism, we ought to recognize that there is surely some anxiety in artistic creation or in many performative activities like musical interpretation. There is also anxiety when the encounter with a great work of art forces a revolution in our ways of seeing life. This is even greater in the case of a religious conversion, as you know. The anxiety tied to political action is today gravely obscured by the neutralization and lack of emergency that too often makes this activity a professional routine that requires the stability of the system in order to succeed. Please, let me just be re-elected in 4 years. That I don't want to be. And by the way, also the union, the policy of the unions. If a union asks for an increase of salary, it has to go to the extreme in order to obtain the increase of a salary, but cannot do the revolution, because the revolution would mean that any increase of salary has no meaning at all. There is no national bank any longer, and so there are limits. And this is also the problem of the anxiety or non-anxiety of political activity. Tout change, le plus ça change, le plus c'est la même chose. One says in French, you change everything, democracy, every 4 years we have elections, nothing at all. Almost never. What Heidegger as philosopher calls us to do is to remember being by exiting from the forgetfulness of metaphysics that equates being with given entities, and thus with the order where the true is what there is, famous expression of Quine. To think, denken for Heidegger, is andenken, remember. To remember being as event means ever more clearly, also for our specific historical setting, to grasp the happening of truth as a conflict that imposes a decisive undertaking of responsibility. That's all.